Yo, what's going on, everybody? My name is Andrew. I'm with Better Recording Studio. I just wanted to make a short little informative video on what you should be considering when you're going to choose a recording studio. So the first consideration, which is often overlooked, is the room. The room that the studio is built in has a huge impact on how your sound and your music will be made. So the first consideration as far as the room goes is isolation, soundproofing. How has this studio been constructed to where it'll keep outside noise from coming in and your noise from getting out? Of course, you got to deal with neighbors and sirens going on outside, so many different things to consider. Now, a professionally built and constructed studio that was meant for music recording is going to be made out of a super rigid material, a rigid material that's going to stop sound waves from being able to penetrate the walls. Now, in a residential area, they're not built with soundproofing specifically in mind, so they're going to use different materials that aren't able to stop sound waves from penetrating through. You probably experienced it at your own home. You can hear the neighbors whenever they start bumping around or walking around. In a professional recording studio, usually they use a material that's going to stop those sound waves, specifically bass sound waves, from coming straight through the wall. One thing that'll be a dead giveaway if the studio is using rigid material is checking the door. They use a certain material inside the door that makes it a little heavier, but it stops sound from being able to bounce straight through that door. Another consideration when you go into a studio to make sure that it's well isolated is to see if it's sealed. Around the windows, especially around like under doorways, wherever air can get in, sound can get in. Now, this is not too often that you see, but sometimes in the best constructed studios, they'll also use a technique called decoupling, which is where they put a room inside of a room. That little gap in between is like a buffer. It acts as a buffer to stop the sound from penetrating. It'll penetrate that first wall and it'll lose a lot of its power before it can get through the second wall. Next thing you want to consider is the acoustic treatment of the studio that you're in. I'm in what's called the control room, and then there usually will be a vocal booth or a live room. There's a few things that will mess up recording and the music making process that you want to consider. The first is flutter echo. This is where the sound waves are bouncing against close surfaces, flat surfaces, and they're bouncing off really fast. It'll sound something like this. The closest cousin of flutter echo is something called reverb. That's where tons of these sound waves are bouncing off of surfaces and they come back a little slightly slower than the original signal, but you definitely can hear it. It sounds like this. And the third and maybe the biggest consideration you want to think about is what's called standing waves. In any room that you're ever in, whenever sound is being generated in that room, the sound wave is going to bounce off the surfaces. And if you have enough of these sound waves bouncing off surfaces and they end up standing on top of each other, if they stand on top of each other at a peak of that signal, of that specific frequency, that frequency is going to be boosted. If they meet at a certain dip of that frequency, then that frequency is going to be reduced or attenuated. Now, why does this affect your music? Well, if an engineer is in the listening position and he's in the exact point where a certain frequency is being attenuated or decreased, he's going to listen to it. He's going to say, oh, if it's a bass, he's going to say, oh, this needs more bass. You know what I mean? And then he's going to take an equalizer and boost that frequency. And it's going to sound good while he's in this room, but he'll give you your song, you'll listen to it in the car, and you'll be like, wow, why is there so much bass? Because the room he made his mixing decisions in was imperfect. It had a deficiency in that frequency. Same thing in the opposite. Usually at like home studios and in home environments, bass builds up. Bass frequencies are so large and they take such a long time to develop that they stand up on top of each other. And so you're listening in a room and you think you got so much bass, it sounds so good. Then you take it to your car, then you finna listen and it's finna be great, and the bass is gone. Sound like little puny kicks. And now there are different equipment and different tools that will be installed in different studios to handle these things. The first of which is absorptive padding. Absorptive padding really helps with that flutter echo and that reverb. It literally just stops the sound wave from bouncing off that wall. That only helps with certain frequencies though. Bass frequencies are a lot harder to capture. Bass frequencies will usually use bass traps. Go to the studio and look for these bass traps, usually in the corner. Now, to stop these standing waves, which is the worst offender of an imperfect room, they will have what's called diffusers. Diffusers are meant so when that wave bounces off the surface, it gets redirected in another direction or it gets offset in some way. The main way to figure out if it's working is to go in the room, see if you can play something out of their speakers and hear if a certain frequency sounds a little louder in a certain spot in the room. That's a dead giveaway that it's not well acoustically treated. I'm not saying it has to be perfect, but you want to know that the people are taking their time to actually analyze their room and get it as accurate as possible. Another way that studios are constructed to stop standing waves is the actual shape of the room. If you have 4 parallel walls like a box, that is a haven for standing waves in flutter, echo, and reverb, because the sound waves can just bounce right off and stack on top of each other. In a professionally built recording studio, they're going to have uneven surfaces. They're going to have jagged surfaces. They're going to have diffusers all over the place, just so that these waves can't bounce right off and stack and become friendly with each other and cause your music to sound inaccurate in that listening environment.